All right, Mark. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's been a real blessing to read your book, Finding My Words. The work that I do with clients is exploring their story. I like taking a narrative approach. So as I was reading your memoir, it's like you've done the work and the hard work of facing your past and facing your story. And like it's a good example. And I'm looking forward to sharing this interview with clients and friends, and also your book with others.
Thank you.
All right. So please, I read your bio, but can you say a little bit more? Introduce yourself to
Sure,
listeners, Mark.
sure. I'd be glad to. My name is Mark McNear, and I am a licensed clinical social worker. I live in New Jersey. So I live about an hour from Manhattan in Northwest Jersey. I am married. My wife and I have been married for, I think, 38 years, 39 years. And I have a daughter, Emily, who lives in Wyoming with her husband, Brandon. And I am actually expecting my first grandchild the end of June. So that's a little bit of the personal stuff. Professionally, I'm a therapist and I work in private practice. I have recently, as you alluded to, written a book, Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. So I wrote the book and I see clients and do some other writing and speaking. And so it's been a good journey, a hard journey, as you have read, but a good journey. A lot of trauma, but the Lord has really, really helped me to work through a lot of it. And I'm still working through it, and I want people to hear that. I have been doing this for about 9 years now, a little bit over 9 years, and I'm still working in story work and in counseling and things like that. Just trying to continue to heal from the extreme trauma that I had.
Yes. Yeah. As we talk, as you just described that, I'm curious about how you integrate your faith and your practice, and especially with trauma, in the area of trauma.
Yeah, it's a very natural thing for me. I don't like really force it, where it fits, it fits. I think that we are definitely created in the image of God. We look at the story of scripture, the gospel, and we read that, God wanted us to have fellowship with him, and that things didn't work out so well in the garden. And so there was the fall, and sin came in. And so, as a result of sin, there's been a lot of harm in this world. And I really see that since I've gone through a lot of the healing, Savant, I really see the redemptive work of God in my life, and I see it in others. I think that, in a book like I wrote, I wanted to write it and I wanted to say, you know what, I was a man who was trained very well, went to a lot of good schools for education, and I knew the Lord from the age of 19. And I fell very greatly. And so, by the grace of God, I got back up. Mm-hmm. And so, I've had issues with addictions, and I've had issues with mental health, with depression and anxiety, and, being diagnosed with complex PTSD. I just wanted to write it from the point of view of a believer, like I said, who fell greatly but got back up. And, in the foreword of the book, I love that Josh McDowell writes, the addiction and abuse and all of the things that I talk about in the book, they don't own our story. And so I wanted to make it where you travel with me into rehab, and then you come home with me, and that I'm really struggling a lot with a lot of things with my childhood. And I talk in the middle of the book, chapters 4, 5, and 6, about physical abuse and sexual abuse and verbal abuse and emotional abuse, and pretty severe things that had happened to me, and just me trying to process those things. And mm-hmm. I don't believe that we were ever created to have to go through those things. And so as a result of going through them, I was pretty banged up, and so I needed to really work on processing those things and going deeper with those. And, I've been doing story work just recently with a gentleman, Scott Moore, who is trained at the Allender Center and has really been really instrumental in continuing my healing. journey. So I wanted to write it to say, yeah, I failed greatly, that my faith was instrumental in my healing, that God walked with me every step of the way, not shaming me,
Yes.
but being filled with grace and mercy and love and coming alongside me. You know, to say to the community, from kind of like being a patient and being a clinician, that, you know, there's no quick fixes, that it takes time, you know, and I'm still dealing with symptoms daily from the trauma that I went through, but I have a really good life.
Yes. Yes. It's so good that you're able to say that, but it took some time and a lot of hard work, a lot of pain. So, Mark, kind of with how you wrote the book, instead of starting at the very beginning, because it was hard for you to face the beginning and remember the past, could you say a little bit more about the falling greatly? Like, what did it look like? How did God like reveal that you needed to address addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was about 9 years and several months ago that I had called my doctor and asked my doctor for refills on my prescription, and they were premature. And so she did the addition and said, you know what, you are using the medication and you're addicted to it. And so she said, you need to go to rehab. And so that was like this moment. I often talk about it being the worst day of my life and the best day of my life, you know. Worst day of my life because that's not, I was ready to go to the pharmacy, pick up prescriptions and continue my life, but that's not what God had planned. And so, you know, it was really good because I was able to start working on the things that were causing the addictions, all of the pain and all of the abuse that I suffered as a child. And so, you know, I think that I wouldn't have been ready to without somebody really pushing me.
External.
Yes,
Yeah.
external source. And so she was very kind with it, but she was very blunt and said, you need to get into rehab. And so she told me that maybe on a Thursday, and by Monday I was in rehab.
Wow. So that really kind of broke into your life.
Yeah.
But so she's a medical professional and she did the math and it wasn't lining up. But your family or coworkers, did you appear fine? Were you managing?
Fine. I think that I was managing it, but not well toward the end. I think that my wife Debbie definitely saw a decline in my functioning toward the end before I went into rehab. And so my daughter Emily knew that I had some issues that I needed to deal with. She didn't bring them up to me because I don't think she thought that I would be receptive to it. Debbie would say
she was at home still.
No, she was in Florida at that time. So she was in Florida, but Debbie would bring up to me, I think you're taking too much medication. I'd be like, no. And listeners to hear, you know, if you're dealing with somebody who is addicted or is dealing with addictions, there's a lot of fear there and there's a lot of pain that needs to be dealt with in a gentle way.
Yeah. So you were taking medication for a medical condition or pain?
I was taking medication for ADHD. I was taking medication for depression. I was taking medication for anxiety and panic disorder. Okay. So, and really what was interesting is all of those were encapsulated in complex PTSD. So, you know, those were symptoms that I was struggling with, but I think the real problem was the trauma. And then I had also hurt my arm. So I had begun taking pain medication, but that was toward the very, very end before I went into rehab.
I see. Yeah. Can you explain, Mark, complex PTSD and like what's the difference between complex PTSD and PTSD or anxiety?
Sure, I'd be glad to. What I would say is that a lot of times when we look at a diagnosis of PTSD, we're looking at maybe a single incident that happened in a person's life where they get diagnosed with complex PTSD. It's a whole pile. And the way that I try to explain it, which is not a very professional way, but it's just down to earth, is, you know what, PTSD is like one pancake on a plate, and complex PTSD is a whole stack of pancakes and a whole stack of pancakes. And so, you know, a lot of the symptoms are similar. I think with complex PTSD, we're dealing a lot more with shame. We're dealing a lot more with emotional dysregulation, flashbacks. You know, not that you can't have those also with PTSD, but it seems to be more intense. with complex PTSD. And, usually we look at PTSD as being a single event or several events, whereas with complex PTSD, we're looking at a prolonged period of time. And what I talk about in the book is probably from the point where I was born until probably 18, 19, 20 years old, there was constant problems with my family.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's extreme, I'd say extreme stress and trauma, violence,
Yeah.
and all forms of abuse for years.
Yeah, and neither one is good. I think that what they talk about in the field now, so on it, is just a prolonged period of enduring abuse.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that you really struggled with was how the emotional dysregulation that you experienced just that affected your ability to function as a student in school. It just amazes me. You're writing a book, you're helping so many people, just surviving and thriving. Despite how hard your childhood was. Before we go into that, as much as you're comfortable, Mark, coming to faith at 19 years old, how did that affect your life, and how did that did it make a difference with the emotional struggles?
That's a great question. When I was 19, I had a very, very serious car accident and almost died. And I ended up in the hospital for a month, another trauma, and I almost passed away. And so after getting out of the hospital, I started searching, and, I say I'm searching, but I think it was God searching for me. And so I began looking into spiritual literature, and I purchased a book by Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking. And in that book, he talks about, getting a Bible, underlining passages of scripture, memorizing verses, things like that. And so I did all of that. And, the other thing he talks about in the book is going to church. And so I went to church, and there was a guest speaker who talked about going the second mile. And so I wasn't totally sure what I was doing, but I went forward, and I definitely began my relationship with Christ at that point. And so in some ways, it helped tremendously to have at least a view of the future and an excitement about the future. But to be honest with you, it didn't help me emotionally to deal with the wounds that I had. And so I think that I did the best that I knew how to do. And then when I was in grad school, I was struggling a lot with anxiety and depression, and also being very scattered. And so I went to a psychiatrist in New York City, and he diagnosed me with major depressive disorder, panic attacks and anxiety, and ADHD. And so again, hindsight now, looking back at it, it was definitely due to my childhood, and definitely due to the abuse that I suffered. But he had given me medication, and it really seemed to help. And it did help, because it calmed me down, and my mood was lifted, and I was able to regulate a little bit better. The problem is that I need more and more to be able to get to that same level. And that's where addiction comes in, and so looking back at it now, I can see that I started taking extra, like, pretty quickly after, because some of the medications that I took wore off pretty quickly.
Okay.
And so I didn't know enough, and didn't trust the physicians enough, and felt like I knew better. And so I went ahead and took the medication, and that was not advisable. But I definitely now look back and go, yeah, that made sense for where I came from.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of folks that I work with Christian backgrounds, they're scared or hesitant to try medication, and you're outlining the reality, the possibility that medications can be addicting, but it can help to have support and guidance with taking medications correctly.
Sure.
And
the field, I think, has gotten better also with they're not there yet, but it's gotten better with not prescribing certain medications that were so addictive. So I think that the thing that I always say is I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because medications can be really helpful, but
Yeah.
they really have to be monitored, of course, closely.
Right.
And
Yeah.
in my case, that wasn't the case.
Yes. Yeah. So some of the medications for anxiety, and then some of the older antidepressants, benzodiazepines, they can
Mhm.
have the tolerance effect where you
Yeah.
need more and
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
But yes, there's other options, and we're learning more about how to do that
Mhm.
safely. What you're describing, Mark, it's for some people it's confusing, where they've experienced trauma in their past, and then they come to the Lord, they accept Jesus into their life,
Mhm.
and start following Christ, but then they still struggle emotionally. It's really important, books like yours, to explain that describe the effects of trauma, that it's, I think you said, like, it's something that your body remembers, and it can take time to recover and heal from that. And
Yeah.
it's not because of a lack of faith.
Yeah, no, I tell this story, and I didn't tell this in the book, but I've told this a few times, and I'll tell it here, that when I was a child, my dad would get home. And when he got home, he would open the garage door. There was an electric garage door. And so it would go up, and you would hear it in the house. And so you knew that my dad was home. And as a result of that, my body would tense, just knowing that depending on what mood my dad was in, it could be a bad day or a bad night. And so, fast forward, I get married to my wife, Debbie. And so we have our home, and it has garage doors and electric garage doors. And, Debbie comes home from work, because I work in the home, and my office is in part of my home. And so the garage door goes up, and my heart just starts pounding, and that part of the brain doesn't differentiate between the past and the present, and so, that's a good example of a trigger. And I didn't know why. I just, felt really guilty and a lot of shame. Like, why should I feel this way with my wife getting home from work, and me hearing the garage door go up? So not only did I have the issue of feeling kind of panicky, but I also felt like really bad and full of shame that I shouldn't feel this way. So I had to connect the past and some of that with what was going on today with my body.
And how did that affect your relationship when she would come home and you'd be
Yeah,
in that state?
yeah, I think that I would be very distanced, and I would be withdrawn, and I didn't know why. And so now, through a recovery process of being able to talk with her about those things, both of us, I understand much better what has taken place. And, one of the things I talk about in the book that a lot of people have quoted me on is the past is not the past when it shows up in the present. And that's what happens with trauma. It doesn't stay in the past, it comes full forward to the present, and it's very confusing for individuals. People who have been in combat or in wars, and then they come and they hear a car backfire, and it sends them right back there. They are on July 4th hearing fireworks, and it sends them right back to the battlefield.
Right.
So I want listeners to hear that idea that the past is not the past when it shows up in the present.
Yes, when it shows up in the present. And a lot of clients that I meet with, they come and they're confused, they're struggling. They just want to understand why. Why am I the way I am? Why is this so hard? Why is life so hard? And sometimes letting those memories come up, or facing the wounds and pain from the past, can give a lot of comfort, or like self-compassion about why these symptoms are and these patterns and triggers are in our lives. But just understanding why doesn't heal us.
No, we have to kind of step into it, and just even realizing that, for me, one of the struggles I had is the lack of memories, which is very common with trauma, and understanding brain function, that, when you're traumatized, certain parts of the brain shut down, and so you don't have access to them. So you end up with this fragmented story, where there's memories, and then there's not, and then there's gaps in your childhood, or gaps in you'll remember this birthday, but you won't remember that birthday. And so it's unsettling until you kind of come to grips with that was normal. Your body's acting normally for what you've been through, and that your brain was overwhelmed with what was happening. And so it makes sense that you don't have the memories that someone would have that didn't have those experiences.
I like the illustration that you put in the book about a computer hard drive.
Yeah.
Being fragmented.
Right. And so a lot of the exciting thing is like a lot of the story work that I'm doing now, it brings right brain and left brain together, and when you're able, as Dan Allender talks about, when you're able to talk about your story in a safe environment with kindness, somebody with kindness, it brings so much healing to both areas of the brain.
Yes. Yeah. I think Gabor Mate talks about having that safe place to be able to process and being alone in the trauma and not being able to tell the story is so much of the trauma, not only what happened.
Yeah, not having that empathetic witness. And that's what, good story work does with someone that you can tell the story to, and that they enter the story with kindness.
What are your thoughts, Mark, on doing that work or having an empathetic witness? Is that just for, this is a little bit of a leading question, is that for professionals and people who have been trained? I guess my better question is, how do we as the church support people and be part of the healing in people's lives? How do we support people with trauma?
Yeah, how many hours do you have? I think that is such a great question. I think
write another book.
That's right. I think that we look at the fact that, and I remember Larry Crabb once saying this, that if the body of Christ operated in the way that it should, we wouldn't need nearly as many counselors. So not even with story work, but just hearing people and hearing what, and I guess that is stories. It might not be formal story work like in counseling, but, just hearing what other people have to say. We need to be careful. We need to hold off on giving advice. We need to hold off on giving judgment. We need to just be there and to be able to hear what the person has to say. I've read it so many times, and I'm sure you've heard where one of the problems is that when we're listening, we're not listening. We're listening to reply, and so, I see this all the time in different groups and stuff where people are quick to give advice. And I don't think it's helpful in the healing process and in communities where real healing takes place. It's where people can listen and they don't really have to say much at all, except, I'm here for you. Maybe I'm praying for you.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe share a verse of encouragement, but not one of advice.
It's being patient. Going slow is so important.
Yeah, we live in such an instant world where things need to get resolved really quickly, and that's not real life. I remember, so I'm being in rehab, and there was a great guy. His name was Joe Garbley, and he was a psychiatrist, and he just knew this much of my story, not much at all, but he knew that I had been sexually abused, and he knew that I had been traumatized, and he said to me in one of our sessions, "I just want to let you know, Mark, it's going to take a long time, a lot longer than you think." And he threw out the number of 10 years. And it was on one hand, that was really encouraging. On the other hand, it's 10 years. That's a long time. But, he was really accurate in saying that, because it's taken me a long time, to be able to stay pretty regulated on a daily basis.
Yeah. It's almost been 10 years.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the that hard day, that good hard day where you were confronted, and you pretty quickly got into rehab. Do you have any thing you could share with someone who might be listening, or maybe a family member who's concerned about someone they love someone who's wrestling with going to rehab or talking about their past, the abuse that maybe they've never shared that before, or someone who's afraid of going to counseling. Can you share a little bit, Mark, about some encouragement with that, or
Sure.
something that would help them to know?
Yeah, I was petrified. Like I was so scared. And I think the Lord has really used that in my life to even be more empathetic toward people who are even coming into my office, because the bravery that it takes, you have to be courageous to come in, to begin to even talk about it. And good trauma work doesn't push people to talk. It sits with people and allows people to regulate their body or get to the point where they can tolerate talking about the things in their body. And so I think that anybody that's sitting there and going like, I can imagine myself doing that. That was me.
Yeah.
To be able to talk about things that I had promised that I would never talk about ever in my life, that now I can talk about pretty freely without, my body filling with anxiety or me becoming emotionally dysregulated. So that quote that I put in the book by Gabor Mate, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain.
Why the pain? Yes.
I want people, whether they are struggling with addiction or whether they have somebody around them who's struggling with addiction. I think that is such a brilliant quote, because so many times we focus in on the addictions and they have to be dealt with, for somebody to live a healthy life. But we have to look beyond that into the pain that the person is carrying, that the person is really trying to regulate their emotions through addiction.
As a coach, and just because I'm a nerd about habits and self-improvement and growth, so many podcasts and books are about behavior modification and morning routine and dopamine addiction and changing routines and habits. But it's so difficult to be consistent and grow and mature and change without addressing the pain.
Yeah.
And I think the root thing.
I needed to do two things at the same time. I needed to allow the pain to be there, but I needed to keep moving. I needed to get up at a regular time every day. I just it was hard to do. It was really tough to do, but I did it. I went to meetings in the beginning. A lot of times I didn't talk in meetings. Most of the time I didn't talk in meetings, but I sat and I listened and I was there.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to, if somebody has something like, let's say, abuse or something, Savannah, and they have, carried it their whole life and, pretty much terrified to talk to anyone about it. What I would say is, really pray about finding somebody that you could begin to share a little bit with, just a tiny bit, and maybe somebody who's been through it before, and has gone through the process, and just take it slow. Take it really, really slow. I think I put in the book that I'm a pretty driven person. And so it was kind of like I wanted to take a sledgehammer and kind of beat these behaviors. And, that was not the way. Colleague, Jay Stringer, who wrote the book Unwanted,
Yes.
about brokenness, he had shared a verse with me that I'm sure that I've heard a million times, but it was when he shared it with me, I don't know, it was just like the Lord brought it to me. And it's in Romans 2:4. It's the kindness of God that leads to repentance. It's the kindness of God that leads to transformation or change. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not always good with it, I'll be honest with you, but I'm getting better. I'm better than I was, 5 years ago, just bringing kindness and compassion to myself.
Yes, it's so good. You experience so much harshness and hurt from your dad. And so to be able to give yourself that kindness and gentleness and receive that from other people, it was huge. One thing I really appreciate, Mark, when you, in your book, you were like mostly through rehab and you were still like not opening up. And it was so, and I really like that because it was so like real that it truly was excruciating to
Yeah.
to not just hold the memories and share them, to even have the memories come up and even have them in your body and in your brain.
Yeah.
It was so painful.
Yeah,
And
I talk about a friend in rehab, and we're still friends to this day, and we talk every week just about. And he had shared with me, he said, you know what, when you get out of here, find somebody safe to talk to about these things. And he didn't press me at all about the things that I was struggling with. And it just takes time. I want people, if they don't walk away from the podcast with anything else, I want them to walk away hearing that it takes a lot more time than they realize. And it took a lot more time for me, and they have their life ahead, to keep working on these things. And so take it slow and find somebody who can help you to regulate, because the problem, if you don't, is that you end up re-traumatizing yourself. If you tell the stories and you're not in a regulated body, it re-traumatizes you.
Take your time. That person in rehab gave you permission to not tell the story. Tell it when you were ready. One of my favorite shows is This Is Us. And they, the rehab, it's like 2 episodes, one episode of individual, and then the second episode, the family comes in, they have family meeting, and it's all like great, and so like sometimes we see that like, no, it takes months and years.
And I didn't want to write the book and say, guy falls down, really struggles, gets back up and goes to rehab, and everything's good and everything's fine afterwards. I wanted to write about everyday symptoms and everyday struggles and dysregulation and things like that. And it's so much less than it used to be, but it's still there. And there's the reverberations of it that, I noticed today. I was actually with my pastor and with another friend that we do a podcast together with our church. And I noticed when I was walking around with them that the abuse was like just kind of going through my head. So that would be a type of flashback. It wouldn't be crippling, at this point in my life, but it was playing while I was walking around. And so I didn't want to make it unrealistic. And by the last couple of chapters, a lot of times we do that in Christian books, and where it's like all good and all wonderful, and no, it's not. There's struggles. Every day something reminds me of the abuse I have, but on the other hand, the goodness of God has been so prevalent in my life, and I get to see Him showing up every day in my life with the kindness, with grace, with mercy, all of the things that He talks about in Scripture.
Yeah. In the book, you mentioned like the baths and are helpful to calm and soothe you. When you were younger, like music was like a distraction. It was like a way not to feel. But absolutely. it sounds like it's a way of regulating.
Music and certain types of music especially can be really helpful with people who've had trauma. Doing coloring, mindfulness coloring. Playing with putty can be really helpful. Playing with a worry stone, where you rub, can be helpful. Have a client, and I got permission to tell this story. When she was a little girl, there was a lot of trauma in her home, Christian home, and a lot of trauma. And she found that she would rub her fingers on her pillowcase, and it would be very self-soothing to her. And so as she grew up, she found taking a piece of string and rolling it in her fingers did the same thing and helped her. And she does it to this day, as a grown woman, but it helps her to regulate. And so part of it, talking about 2 different things here. We're talking about, being able to process the trauma, but regulate your body, but finding ways to regulate your body, whether it's breathing or whether it's tapping. Tapping can be really helpful. Humming sometimes can be helpful with regulating the body. Baths, sometimes cold baths for dopamine, sometimes warm baths at night to help you to sleep. Things like that can be really helpful.
Nice. Yeah. So those are some of the things that can soothe and calm your nervous system. Can you contrast, Mark, a little bit more clearly, emotional dysregulation and regulation?
Sure. So
emotionally regulated.
Daniel Siegel talked about the window of tolerance. this window in between. But one of the ways that I try to share it with my clients is I talk about there's a hyper aroused state. And I usually tell them, like, think about being in a red zone. And the hyper aroused state is anxious and angry and not being able to sit still and just climbing out of your skin. And flip it down to the blue zone, and that's like doom scrolling and being on your phone for like hours at a time, or vegging or sleeping, things like that. So you have the red zone and you have the blue zone. One is hyper aroused, the other is hypo aroused. And so really where we want to get is the green zone, which is the zone where we function the best. And people pretty much know where their zone is when they're in that zone, or when they're in it. So part of the work that I do with clients is just helping them to get in touch with their body and to ask the question at different times, like, what zone am I in now?
Yes.
Because there'll be certain exercises that they can do if they're hyper aroused, and others if they're hypo aroused, to bring them more up to that green zone. And I think that one of the things from the literature and what I experienced in my own life, so on this, is that idea of dysregulation, just not a hard time regulating your emotions. And so many times this has been so pathologized, but it's actually something that is really adaptive in so many ways. And so your body's acting just the way it should for what you've gone through.
Okay. So understanding that those dysregulated responses, hypo or hyper arousal, they're actually like they're actually appropriate.
Yeah, for what you've been through. Yeah. They're not helping today, but they're really adaptive for where you've been.
Right.
And so if you can kind of reframe it and say, you know what, yeah, of course I'm anxious. Look at what I've been through.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to kind of work through the shame and the guilt and again, not pathologizing it, but looking at it as a normal response for an abnormal situation.
Yes. Yeah. Now, this might be a whole other podcast episode, but
okay.
but what you just shared, like not pathologizing, what are your thoughts on the connection between trauma and ADHD?
Well, that is about maybe 4 more podcasts. I think that I can speak for myself that I was diagnosed as having ADHD, and it was really misdiagnosed because I really had complex trauma. Mm-hmm. So as I've been able to sit and work through these things and take the time to become curious about different things that are going on in my body has settled a lot, and I don't have the symptoms of ADHD anymore.
Yes.
Now, again, I'm really careful that I want to keep a balance there, because I've worked with kids and I've worked with adolescents and I've worked with adults that clearly have ADHD. And so I don't want to, again, throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to get a balance and to say that there seems to be some evidence that people, and in my case there is, that people who have been diagnosed with ADHD really didn't have ADHD, but they had complex trauma.
Yes. Yeah. I just use the tool or illustration of the Venn diagram. I'm not a specialist in ADHD. I'm a specialist in panic and insomnia. And the symptom list, the symptoms of anxiety and depression and ADHD, there's so much overlapping. And so is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Well, we don't know. But so many of the things that are helpful for anxiety and depression and ADHD are the same.
And what we had talked about earlier, I think that listeners, if they want to go further with this, there's Gabor Mate's books are really good on issues of ADHD and kind of the myth of normal and things like that. And In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, that's another one of his books. I would encourage listeners to kind of look into his work or look him up on YouTube.
Yes.
Really good material.
Yeah. Yeah. And your book is different than many memoirs because each chapter has process questions and very helpful questions on how does reading your story and reflecting on the different things that you went through, how does yeah, where is the reader
Mhm.
with telling their story or any wounds or abuse that they've gone through.
Yeah,
Um,
everybody has a story. Everyone has a story, and it has impacted them in particular ways, and it impacts them differently than maybe somebody else, but it's still their story. And I think that I have just experienced so much healing as I've gone through the process of
yeah,
looking at some really dark things in my story, but having somebody with kindness sit with me
right, right,
and
right.
and to kind of emotionally hold my hand as I've gone through them.
Yes, yeah. This interview, Mark, it's gone different than I envisioned or expected. I do want to give you the chance to share. Is there any story that you would like to share with listeners that kind of encapsulates or summarizes not just the happy ending, but like what you went through?
Sure.
'Cause-
One of the stories that I first tell in the book, after I get out of rehab, it is the idea that when I was about 4 years old, my dad, um, we were at the dinner table and we were eating our dinner, and there were carrots there, cooked carrots there, and I didn't want to eat the carrots. And so I remember really not wanting to eat them, and my dad, forcing me to eat them to the point where I ended up vomiting. And my dad picked me up and threw me actually across the room into the garbage and said, "Stay there. You're a piece of garbage. That's where you belong." And so a story like that is heartbreaking,
yeah,
but it also gives you a label as a person, that's where you belong. And so again, tell the story with that. Fast forward to about 28, 29 years old. Debbie, my wife, and I are at a wedding, and they have steak and they have potatoes and they have cooked carrots. And
mm,
so I stab into one of the carrots, and not thinking about it, I take it and put it in my mouth, and right away, immediately, I start gagging and having that reflex. And so it brought it right back to me at that moment. And so I think that's where I talk about the past is not the past when it shows up in the present. Your body carries these memories with it. So that's one of the stories that was a really hard story to put down, but something that I wanted to tell,
mm,
because to this day I can't eat cooked carrots. So a lot of times people will say things like, "Oh, it's the past. The past is the past." Well, there's no such thing as the past. The past comes up every day in our lives, and so we have to work through the past.
yeah. The the physical effects of that, and what he did, uh just so cruel to a 4-year-old. But what he said, it's not just the physical effects, but just speaking that into your life, it really affecting how you saw yourself.
Yeah, and me carrying that in my life, and then getting saved and going to Bible college, and then feeling a drive to get more education and more education and more education. And I have degrees on my wall, and they're really good, and I'm really really thankful for them, but they didn't fill the void of that day when my
Mhm.
father said that to me,
Yeah,
plus
yeah,
other things he would say, like I was stupid and things like that.
yeah. You have so many degrees. You work so hard, and it's helpful. The education, it enables you to help your clients, but you also needed that healing.
Yeah, it doesn't fill the void, and I think that's the point that I made in the book, that I was so pursuing trying to fill that harm that happened, in that getting degree after degree after degree, while it's really helpful, wasn't helpful in that area.
Yeah,
So I had to kind of sit with that.
yeah, yeah. When you went to rehab, it 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 wasn't like this floodgate opening up, like, oh,
Mm-mm.
finally I can tell my story. I think that's like
Mm-mm.
what some, well, certainly some intake appointments with clients are that way. They finally
Yeah,
can like
sure.
to tell
Yeah.
it. But you've been able to tell your story with your book, and even today here on the podcast, you're saying a little bit more that wasn't in the book.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
really,
Yeah, definitely.
it's really an honor to hear God's work in your life
Yeah.
and in your
Yeah.
family. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really good.
Yes.
Hard, really hard, but really good.
Yeah. So as we wind things down for today, any last thoughts, Mark?
Just I would encourage people, and I would want to reiterate what I said, just take it slow with trauma work. Find ways to regulate yourself. Don't push yourself and don't re-traumatize yourself. Be kind to yourself. Listen to other people's stories. If you're not able to tell yours yet, try to listen to other people's stories. And just take your time with it. That's the thing that I would say is that, like I said, I'm going on 10 years and I tend to keep working and healing and getting better. And so in the midst of that, I would say for people, again, I would go back to that idea with addiction, that so many times we focus on the addiction and we don't focus on the pain behind it. So if somebody's there listening and they've had problems with addiction, or they have somebody in their family that is having problems with addiction, the addiction is not the issue. It's become an issue, but it's not the issue. The issue is the pain that they're becoming and not able to deal with yet.
Right. For folks watching, for folks listening, I definitely recommend Mark's book and the questions that he asks and the space that he allows in the book to journal and start to tell the stories, to start to heal. And we will put links to the book in the show notes, and ways that you can stay connected with Mark. Thank you again, Mark. I hope this will be a good rest of the summer. Thank you for coming on. It's Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yes. May. We're taping this in May. Yeah. So
yes, at the time that we're taping. Congratulations on the upcoming grandchild. Are you gonna head out to Wyoming?
Yes, we're not sure yet when, but we are headed out. Yeah, definitely.
Nice. Yeah. So it'll be nice to know that you're a little closer to Portland, Oregon this summer, Mark. Yeah, and absolutely, if you make your way out here, would love to meet up with you.
That would be great.
Yes. All right. Thank you. God bless you, Mark.
Thank you.